Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we're going to start off where we left off the last time. We are walking through a presentation on really responding to alleged Bible contradictions that we find on the atheist.org website. And so we're in the midst of talking about inerrancy, which is the fact that the scriptures are without error, because one of the challenges made was that if the Bible is from God, then it won't have any contradictions, and Christians believe in inerrancy. And so I was explaining what that was. So as we go through this, we had actually left off here on number 5. We had been talking about transmission, how the New Testament manuscripts are transmitted. So we talked about 2 questions had to be answered. Number 1, is the text accurately transmitted? And number 2, the historicity. In other words, is it telling us the truth? Because it can be accurately transmitted, but it can tell us a lie. So we're on number 5. We had talked about a lot of the errors and how they occur in the New Testament manuscripts, the fact that they don't actually affect any understanding. We gave some examples of that. So we're going to continue on here with number 5, which is called A Fact of Great Security to New Testament Accuracy. So in AD 303, Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered 3 edicts of persecution upon Christians to destroy churches, manuscripts, and books and people. Estimated thousands of manuscripts were destroyed across the Roman Empire during the persecution, which lasted until AD 311. So it was in AD 313 that the Edict of Milan, or the Edict of Toleration by Constantine, was brought in. But even if Diocletian had succeeded, and this is from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, in wiping every biblical manuscript off the face of the earth, he could not have destroyed the ability to reconstruct the New Testament. Why? Because the early church fathers, men of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others, quoted the New Testament so much, and you got the quote numbers there, that all but 11 verses of the New Testament can be reconstructed just from their quotation alone. Now, the 11 verses has been challenged by some, but that's not the point here. The point is you could really put the New Testament together and know what it said. So let's hear Turek on this.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hello, my name is Matthew.
Hey, Matthew.
So I'm just curious because you earlier were mentioning something about how we don't necessarily need the Bible to understand morality. Is that correct?
You get more details in the Bible that you wouldn't have if you didn't have it, but basic right and wrong, thou shalt not kill, murder, steal, that we know that intuitively.
Okay. So I guess my question is, so assuming that's true either way, would you agree the Bible is written by men?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's written by men, yeah.
And this is something that I can struggle with, but I study linguistics, and I do a lot of stuff with languages, and to my knowledge, and I think to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name me off the top of the head because it's something I just recently was reading, but it was like some form of like ancient Greek was the original version of language that the New Testament was written in. Is that what you believe as well?
Jesus probably spoke either Aramaic or Hebrew, and it was written in Koine Greek, yes.
Yes, okay. So how do we believe, or how do you believe, rather, it might be a better question, the Bible was written originally? Like, so do you believe, up there it says opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples. Are you saying written, like the Gospels according to Mark were written by Mark, or are you saying that just disciples is in somebody that follows like the teachings of the Bible or something like that?
Who wrote the Gospels is the question, or?
Yeah, just addressing the one point saying the opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples. So I was just wanting a clarification.
Okay, yes. Well, as far as we know, the writers of the New Testament, there's 8 or 9 writers depending upon who wrote Hebrews. Most of them bear the name of the person, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except, you know, the letters of the Apostle Paul, there's about 13 of them. And then there's other letters written by people like Peter, Jude.
So clarification, you believe
James.
the Gospels according to Mark was written by Mark?
Yes.
Okay. The same exact disciples, like, written in the Bible. So Mark, in the Bible, wrote the Gospels according to Mark. Yes?
He wrote the Gospel according to Mark.
Okay.
That's what the earliest evidence shows, yes.
Well,
now, he was probably getting his information mostly from Peter. That's the thought there.
Well, I would say that most of the evidence points to that being completely false, because the people at this time and Mark, the position that he was in socioeconomically, had no knowledge of Greek at all.
Oh, no, sure
And
they did.
I disagree. I think most historians would disagree with that, and I think most biblical scholars admit that Mark did not write the Gospels according to Mark. You just attest to it.
Wait, are you saying Koine Greek did not exist in the first century?
No. I'm saying that most people spoke Aramaic at that time. Most people also did not speak Hebrew, ancient Hebrew that was mostly attested to religious figures. And as fishermen and as these followers of Jesus, they were not in the church. They were not wealthy. They did not have high socioeconomic standing that is associated with knowing either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek.
Well,
So,
what you're doing, though, is you're taking aggregate data, Matthew, and you're applying it to individuals. And you can't do that.
Oh.
You can go the other way.
sorry, why not?
It would be like saying that...
I mean, we look at statistics, we look at evidence, and we say, to our best of the knowledge, people of his socioeconomic standing did not have the knowledge of this language to be able to write the Gospels according to Mark in point A Hebrew.
What you can't do is, like suppose you say that the average, I'm making something up, the average income in Fairfax, Virginia is $100,000 a year per household. And that's the average. You can say, okay, that's the average, but you can't point at one person in here and say, you're making $100,000. You can't take aggregate data and apply it to individuals, just like you can't take the aggregate of the knowledge of the first century and apply it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, because you don't know if they were a special case.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, is that we don't know specifically. And so when you don't know specifics, you go by aggregate data because that's what the closest average person is.
But if you have testimony from reliable people that says they did write it, just like if I had testimony from reliable people that said that that man did make $100,000, then I would say or 200 or whatever it was, then I would go with that rather than trying to apply the aggregate data to the individual.
Sure, but where do we see any evidence or statements that are reliable saying that Mark is able to speak and write exquisite point A?
The early church fathers widely attested the gospel writers to the names that we have now, and there is no other data from that time period which suggests any other authors.
Sorry, but the religious figures at that time are very notorious for completely fabricating information or records about religion.
Matthew, you are again taking aggregate data and applying it to individuals. What?
And I'm saying that because we have no knowledge of these specific people at that time, we have to go by the best possible information.
No, we do have knowledge. We have people writing and attesting about it.
Yeah, you're saying religious figures who, again, are notorious for going back into the period of time that Jesus existed, where the records were contemporaneous.
Matthew, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
What would the writers of the New Testament, what motivation would these people have to invent all this?
I don't claim to know any motivation.
Okay, so then why are you applying nefarious motives to these people that you don't even know?
Are you talking about... No, I'm talking about two separate people. You're saying that we have writings from religious figures who, in that same vein, fabricated evidence, such as... I don't remember the exact guy's name, but there was a really famous... I think it was like Josephus, who's a very famous Roman historian. Josephus, sorry. Pronunciation's wrong. I wasn't sure the exact pronunciation, but he's very famous for being very, strict in writing about historical figures, especially religious Messiah figures at the time. And it's been pretty accurately debunked that the writing that was in Josephus's work about Jesus existing was completely fabricated by religious figures at the time.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not true.
That is true.
No, Matthew. Matthew,
I mean, we can disagree, but
okay.
There is one truth. So.
First of all, the only way you can tell if somebody is misquoting something is if you know what the actual quote was. right? So what should Josephus have said rather than... You're talking about the famous passage in Josephus. Now, scholars do agree that Christians altered some of what he said, but we have an Arabic version that appears unaltered. And it still talks about Jesus, and Josephus also talks about Jesus when he talks about the death of Jesus' brother James. But I don't know what that has to do with Mark writing Mark. Let's just say you're right. Let's just say we don't know who wrote the Gospels. So, does that mean that what was written in the Gospels is false?
No, not saying that. I was just saying that it shows that they're trying to put this in a more elegant situation, but to attest that the writers were there at the time and that these specific biblical figures lends truth, if you believe in that, to the authenticity of the Bible. And I'm just saying that that does not seem to be the case.
Okay.
I'm saying you use that as further proof, once you already believe, of evidence of, oh, look, Mark was there, Mark wrote the Bible, this has to be true, or this is more likely to be true.
Okay, look, yeah, we know documents and sources were written very early. I didn't have time to go through it here. Yeah. Even Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic from UNC Chapel Hill, admits Paul writes 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. And an ancient creed that talks about Jesus dying and rising from the dead and everybody that he appeared to comes all the way from the 30s AD. It can't be legendary. That creed is put in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. This is very early stuff. It cannot be legendary. Now, the question is, how do you interpret the data, not what is the data? People, atheists, Christians, everyone in between, agree on the data. The question is, how do you interpret it? Do you say Jesus rose from the dead or not? You know, Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic at UNC Chapel Hill, will not take a position on an alternative explanation for the resurrection because he knows that every position he tries to take has holes in it that can't support the weight of the evidence. So the real question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Not who wrote the Gospel of Mark, or whether Mark told everything exactly the way it should have been told. The question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that's really the issue.
Sure. So kind of a funny thing, but that was leading into my point about morality, was just if the Bible is written by man, and if we don't necessarily know the authenticity or whether or not these people are telling the truth, whether or not they're lying or not, how do we go about understanding better of what is God's morality? Because we have to just make assumptions based off of the Bible, based off of what we believe God has said or God has done, and we interpret that in various ways. So my point was more, it does seem like, sure, if God exists, there's an objective morality, because whatever God commands is objective morality. But my point being is, how do we, as people, understand exactly what that is when God himself did not write the Bible, when it's just other people saying this is the case, and it's other people's interpretations? Because when you write something down, especially when God is saying this or God is saying that, or God commands in certain ways, when people write this down, how do you know they're accurately writing the events, and how do you move from a relative understanding of your own personal interpretation of morality of the Bible to a divine, this is...
All right, let me just ask you a quick question, and then we got a line behind us, so we'll have to go. The quick question is this: do you have any doubt that murder is wrong? That rape is wrong? That theft is wrong?
I mean,
do you have any doubt?
Sorry, we have to define motive. So if motive is just
do you have any doubt that murder is wrong?
Most likely, no.
No, you don't have any doubt, right?
No.
That's my point.
I would specify that there are situations and there's a struggle that personally I believe, but I won't go into this, but it has to do with whether or not my eternal life in heaven is worth other people's lives. More or less, if I could murder somebody and then that would send me to hell, but it saves hundreds of thousands of other people, should I not feel obligated to do so? And so there's cases, I would say, where...
Well, Jesus volunteered to be murdered for my benefit and for yours. Let's talk later, because we're out of time, and I appreciate the question, Matthew.
All right, so I think Dr. Turek did a great job there, so we'll move along. We have some other embedded videos that I'll show to you. So in the following slides, will present a visual presentation of the facts just mentioned and support for the conclusions presented for what we just saw, right? This is by Frederick Kenyon. He used to actually preside over all the manuscripts available in the British Museum some years back. He said, it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Especially is this the case with the New Testament. The number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that the New Testament is more voluminous than any other historical document that has ever existed. That alone provides us not only more of an opportunity for investigation and for validation, but it is a testimony to the fact that it has been preserved not only by the church but through other means, and it can be checked out. God isn't afraid of having his word analyzed and checked out. So the information is there. Like I say, it needs a little elbow grease by people that do that, and that's what they spend their time doing, that are experts in that field, and I think that we all benefit. But the question is, do the New Testament documents tell the truth? Because their transmission can be validated as being accurate, and we can know what the New Testament, at least the original writers, really had put down. We know that. We talked about it by kind of the chain of custody errors and everything else for different geographies. So all those are additions. They're actually not subtractions for trying to know what it was. The question is, do they tell the truth? So let's examine the historicity of the New Testament documents themselves. And we'll do it through 7 E's. And this is taken from Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God. So we're going to look at early testimony, eyewitness testimony, embarrassing testimony, excruciating, expected, extra biblical, that's outside the Bible, and finally elaborate. And through these, we will actually discover that not only do we have what is an accurate copy, but this actually kind of ferrets out the historicity of it. And this provides us more of a security, actually, than all the other historical documents that we possess from the ancient world, that we say, oh, you know, we got people written in history books about Julius Caesar and everybody else, and it's like, well, that's fine, but the amount of information many times that we have on these guys is just a single document found, and it's assumed to be correct. So we have much, much more, not only from the Bible, but outside the Bible to corroborate it. So as far as early testimony, the cross was right around between 33 AD in that era. And then the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The majority of the New Testament was written in between here. Okay, we know Paul was martyred around 65 AD, so there's a pretty good bet what he wrote prior to that, right? James was killed just before that, and then the book of Acts bears that out. Now that's James the Apostle, okay? Acts actually, I'm sorry, that's James the Lord's brother, because the other James is written as being killed in the book of Acts, and that is that James that's listed out there, the Lord's brother, who is the pastor of the Jerusalem church, was in existence when the book of Acts was written. So Luke wrote the book of Acts. 1 Corinthians is pretty solid for about 55 AD. And it references a creed, notice back right after the cross in 1 Corinthians 15, the little creed there that explains the gospel was established probably between anywhere from 6 months to about a year after the cross, so that Christians could all be on the same page and remember what it was that they were communicating. So Luke wrote Acts, and he obviously wrote the book of Acts after his initial Gospel of Luke. So Luke is probably right in between 50 and 54. Mark was earlier than that. Paul's epistles, like I said, was before he was martyred. And then most of the other, except for John's writings, were prior to the temple destruction in 70 AD, because it's not mentioned, which is a pretty good bet because it was such a major issue that we would have at least had it some honorable mention, if nothing else, because it was such a catastrophe. So John's writings would have been, at least the book of Revelation, would have come probably in the 90s. So the age of eyewitnesses, and again, this is within a 35 to 40 year period, the majority of the New Testament. The eyewitnesses are all within that time frame. Even if John wrote some of his books later, he was still within that time frame initially. So here's Frank Turek again.
Most, if all, the New Testament documents were written prior to 70 AD, and the sources from which the New Testament writers wrote go all the way back to the resurrection itself. Even an atheist like Bart Ehrman, a skeptic, admits that 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which talks about Jesus being resurrected from the dead and who he appeared to, goes all the way back within a year or two of the resurrection itself. This is very early data. Now, Paul wrote it down in 55 AD, but it's very early. In fact, Gary Habermas of Liberty University has identified 41 creeds, like the one in 1 Corinthians 15, which predate the writing of the New Testament. This is very early testimony, very difficult to be invented. Let me ask you a question. Let's suppose you are reading a history of Lower Manhattan, and you read the story of the Twin Towers being built. When the book is over, there's no mention of the towers being destroyed on 9/11. When are you going to assume that book was written? Prior to 9/11, obviously. Well, the New Testament doesn't mention an event that was even more dramatic than 9/11, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. Jesus predicts it in his Olivet Discourse, but nobody ever says, look, Jesus was right. Why not? Because the documents were written prior to 70 AD. In fact, even John, which is thought to have been written late, even John in John chapter 5 talks about a pool of Bethesda was destroyed. The pool of Bethesda was destroyed in 70 AD, yet John is speaking of it as if it's still standing when he's writing. Even the book of Revelation indicates, it seems, that the temple is still standing. There is positive evidence that the New Testament writers are likely writing prior to 70 AD.
So he does a better job on that than I do, so that's why I like to put him up there. So here's a chronology, really, of Paul's letters so that we can see the time frames. When we look at it, he probably wrote Galatians first, somewhere around AD 49, and then the Thessalonian epistles, the Corinthian epistles, Romans. The first time he was imprisoned in Rome, which we have at the end of the book of Acts, those were his prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And then 1 Timothy and Titus. And then this says AD 67. He was martyred anywhere from 65 to 67. And 2 Timothy would have been his last epistle. So as we look at the New Testament documents, we see in this chart out of basically, and again, this needs to be updated, but the New Testament on this chart shows about roughly 5,700. It's up to about 5,800 original manuscripts, original language manuscripts, which is Greek. And the number 25 that appears above that is actually the gap in years from the initial one that we have. In other words, the initial copy. So you're within 25 years of the New Testament writing for when you start to get the initial copies. And that's pretty close for the ancient world. Really, the next closest is Homer, and his first copy is 500 years later. And you can see as you go down the line, you're 1,000 to 1,400 years out, really just to see any of the first initial copy. So the closer you are to the transmission of the original documents, obviously you have a much better opportunity to know that they are representing the original documents more accurately, because people are still living within that time frame, and it's been proven that you can't create legend within the short number of years. It takes 3 or 4 generations in order for a legend to begin to take hold, because there's too many people alive at the time that can discredit it. So here's Gary Habermas, who he was talking about.
I was debating a well-known skeptic about 2 years ago. And this fellow had his say. He was having his talk up on the stage. And he said, the Gospels are lousy sources for the life of Jesus. Lousy sources. They're too late. And I got up there, and it was my turn to respond, and I said, do you think we know a lot about Alexander the Great? And he said, oh yeah, we know a lot about Alexander. I said, really? Yeah, we know a lot about Alexander. So when are the first biographies of Alexander written? He said, I don't know. So I'll tell you when the first biographies of Alexander the Great were written. This is ground zero for Alexander the Great. He dies about 330 BC. And the first major source, I'm not talking about an inscription here and a one-liner here. The first major source that might be something like one of our Gospels for Alexander goes like this. That's his fire exit. I think I better not go out this door. One time I went out this door during a lecture, and the door locked. I had to knock on the door to get back in. The earliest source for Alexander, plus 350. John's way too late at 65. Plus 350. And so I said that. I said the best sources for Alexander are Arian and Plutarch, plus 4 1/4 to plus 450. And the guy said, yeah, but the Gospels record miracles. I said, oh, does that do them in for you? He said, yes, it does. I said, well, then once again, I wonder if you've read Greco-Roman history. Because almost no Greco-Roman historian, Thucydides is one of the only exceptions, almost no Greco-Roman historian writes, not even Herodotus, writes without recording the supernatural, miracles, prophecies, all kinds of things. And of course, we can know a lot about Alexander, right? Here's how Plutarch's Alexander begins. It's commonly believed that Alexander was the son of Jupiter and his mother was a virgin. Well, but Alexander's a great source.
So Habermas is he's a great source too. He's good. So and he's an expert in the field. So those are the guys that I want to put in front of you. So we have the testimony of the scrolls, the New Testament scrolls. There are more New Testament manuscripts, and again, these are just the facts of ancient history, than most other books. And again, this number is old. It should be 5,800, but it's 5,700, where the others are, you're dealing with 10 to 20. And if you add the Latin Vulgates, now the span of New Testament documents in the original language span from the 1st century to the 10th century. Now, within that, you start to, in the 3rd century, in 4th century, you start to add Latin copies. So those are also good representatives, because though they're not the original language documents, in other words, they're not written in Greek, you can still trace the accuracy, and you can also follow some of the what we would call the errors of the translation, or we talked about it. It's like a postage stamp or a chain of custody to see what geography it came from and the error and everything else. So the Latin Vulgates, Vulgate meaning vulgar or the common language of Latin that they were translated into, that gives us a tremendous wealth of manuscripts to again validate and substantiate. There's 9,300 early versions of Coptic, Syrian, Armenian, Nubian. Unfortunately, a lot of the Syriac stuff was destroyed. It was priceless by ISIS a few years ago in Syria. But, we're talking a wealth of ancient information here. So if you have 5,800 original language manuscripts, you come out to about 24,000 copies here. So we're going to hear from actually probably like one of the manuscript experts on the planet, Dr. Daniel Wallace, and he can explain some of this to us.
Every single manuscript in the world is written on perishable materials. It's a difficult situation, but once you open a manuscript, now you're making that ink susceptible to deterioration far worse than if you just kept it closed. But if you kept it closed, you can't see what it is. Manuscripts are in danger of deterioration, of theft, and of intentional damage. What CSNTM is actually doing is preserving these manuscripts digitally, which also preserves them physically. I started CSNTM so we could get digital images of Greek New Testament manuscripts that were high quality, available on the internet, so they could be accessed by anyone, anywhere in the world. When we think about these manuscripts, it's not just for students of Greek. Their importance is exponential. We get these manuscripts to connect us back to the time of Jesus and the apostles. Then they get converted into printed texts. There are critical Greek New Testaments that are based on what scholars believe are the very best readings in these manuscripts. Those Greek New Testaments that are published nowadays are what are used by all translators. Our work is helping these translations. These translations are then used by missionaries, by pastors, by teachers of the Bible, by ordinary Christians who want to find out who Jesus is and what the apostles taught about him. Since 2002, CSNTM has digitized more Greek New Testament manuscripts than any other institute in the world. And in the process, we have also discovered more than any other institute. It's difficult to study the manuscript unless someone has access either to the manuscript or to the images. Having them online makes a world of difference. Anywhere in the world where you've got internet connection, you can access CSNTM's images. Our search engine is so flexible, you can type in John 3:16 and it will populate with every single manuscript that has John 3:16 in it, and it'll show just that page so you can find the very verse you're looking for. This has been kind of a world changer for people to actually have access to these handwritten manuscripts, but then making these images and all of our work completely available to everybody for free. for all time. We protect these manuscripts at all costs. When we digitize these manuscripts, we work with the libraries and they retain the copyright, and we protect their rights by not letting these manuscript images be downloaded. The mission statement of CSNTM essentially has two parts. First, to get every single Greek New Testament manuscript digitized and made available. Our ultimate mission is also collaborative, where we work with other institutes and scholars in studying these manuscripts to try to recover the wording of the original text as much as is humanly possible. Our task is urgent and it's significant. Sometime back when we photographed the manuscripts at the National Library of Greece, I came across a colophon, a statement by the scribe at the end of the manuscript. And in a sense, this has become the motto for CSNTM as well. And at the end of this manuscript, which is now over 1,000 years old, he said, "The hand that wrote this is rotting in the grave, but the words that are written will last until the fullness of times." That's the goal that CSNTM has as well.
So I played that because I think it's important to understand who Dr. Wallace is. And he was a scholar, professor at Dallas Theological Seminary for years, probably still there in some aspect, but right now a lot of his work is done here. So let's hear from him again.
The earliest fragments that the Institute in Münster has cataloged so far come from the 2nd century. Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Ryland's papyrus number 457, and this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored. Got his PhD in papyrology and in classics. And he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides. And John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and most likely was to be dated about AD 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's Gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, "This manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, "No, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century." So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century. And with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
Now, of course, we always believed that John's Gospel had the credibility because there was good scholarship that said so. Unfortunately, Bauer and others from the Tübingen School, which is a German school that was a critical school of the Bible. I don't know why people that don't believe the Bible spend a lot of time studying it, but that's what these guys did. F.C. Bauer was one of those. So anyways, Dr. Wallace, I think, gave a good explanation to show how they determine the age of some of these manuscripts. So the Qumran fragments, which we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually are interesting because, as Geisler and Turek state, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, the fragments were found in a cave at the Dead Sea Qumran caves that had previously been identified as containing material from 50 BC to 50 AD. The scholar who first identified these early fragments as New Testament books was Jose O'Callaghan, a noted Spanish paleographer. The New York Times recognized the implications of O'Callaghan's theory by admitting that if it is true, quote, it would prove at least one of the Gospels, that of St. Mark, was written only a few years after the death of Jesus. Again, pretty significant stuff. So we're talking about early. Now, this is kind of a lineup of some of what came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, you have the manuscript and where it is from the New Testament on the left. In the middle, that tells you the cave that it came out of, and then on the right, the estimated date of it. And again, these are all copies. So if you have a copy of Mark from 50 AD, then obviously the original has to be prior to that. So this is some of the way that we get verification that the copies are very close to the original. So as we move through here, we see that there are better New Testament manuscripts, right? 99 or 98 to 99+% accuracy. With most other books, it's really 90 to 95. And like I had mentioned earlier in the previous presentation, the Mahabharata is about 90%, the Homer's Iliad is about 95%, and the New Testament is really 99% plus accuracy of content for transmission. So it's important that we understand that. The testimony of the Church Fathers, again, from I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, we get this listing here, and basically the statement is this. In letters written between 95 and 110, talking about AD, 3 early Church Fathers, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, quoted passages out of 25 of 27 books in the New Testament. Since Clement was in Rome, and again, this would have been probably just after John's martyrdom. He died. He wasn't killed as a martyr, but after he died, the Apostle John. Since Clement was in Rome and Ignatius and Polycarp were hundreds of miles away in Smyrna, the original New Testament documents had to have been written significantly earlier, otherwise they could not have circulated across the ancient world by that time. Therefore, it's safe to say that all of the New Testament was written by 100 AD, and at least those in the left column, which we had seen, several years before 95 AD. Now, that's obviously referring back to, this chart on the on the left that is really pulled out of the book. So you can see up the top, Clement writings, right, from Rome, Ignatius, and Polycarp from Smyrna, and where they quoted from. So amazing. You know, this is very, very, 30,000 foot level for how we look at the New Testament. And as we move on, and we get the testimony of the church fathers, this would be the number that we had talked about earlier, the 36,289 quotes. They are listed here, the church fathers on the left, the number of quotes from where they received them. And so Sir David Dalrymple said, and this is his quote, "I've actually discovered the whole New Testament from those writings except 7 or 11 verses." He says, "I forgot which satisfies me that I could discover them also." In other words, eventually he could probably find those other 7 or 11 verses that he could not find in these writings in particular. The bottom line is this: much of the New Testament can be reconstructed from the writings of the early church fathers without possession of the actual New Testament manuscripts. And the reason this is important is because there are the actual manuscripts, and then there are the church fathers that quoted from them. It's like you do a sermon today, you quote from your Bible, you write the verses and everything. And so this adds to more and more and more testimony of what we have for the New Testament. Here's Daniel Wallace.
Comparison in terms of the number of copies we have for the Gospels versus other ancient documents. I can say in general that the copies we have of the Gospels are far, far more numerous than any other thing we have in the Greco-Roman world, including Homer, which comes in a distant second. And I'm splitting that between the Odyssey and the Iliad. We have, as I've mentioned, about 5,800 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. Most of those are going to have Gospels or part of the Gospels in them. Then we have other ancient translations of the New Testament, beginning with Latin in the 2nd century. We have about 10,000 copies of Latin. Again, most of those are of the Gospels, and then they'll have other portions as well. We have Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, Arabic, Aramaic, numerous languages, and those languages, not counting the Latin, come to at least 5,000, probably more than 10,000 copies. So when you gather all this material together, for the whole New Testament or portions of the New Testament, we've got at least 20,000 copies of the New Testament in some form of these ancient languages. If you were to wipe all those out, and you had a magic wand, you could just destroy all of them in one fell swoop, we'd still be able to reproduce virtually the entire New Testament just from the writings of the church fathers alone, because they commented on the New Testament and they did not have the gift of brevity. And so these church fathers, we have over 1 million quotations of the church fathers from the New Testament. Once again, the Gospels are the primary things that they quote from. Now, let's compare that to just the average classical author. The average classical Greek or Latin author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. Far fewer, typically. Sometimes 1 or 2. Sometimes we have such massive gaps that somebody will mention, I've written these 35 books and we only have 18 of them, or only 4 of them left in existence. Sometimes we're waiting 1,000 years before we see our earliest copy. But let's say the average classical author has 20 copies, to be on the very generous side. You stack those up, they'll be about 4 feet high. Stack up the New Testament manuscripts in the various languages, not counting the patristic quotations, and the stack would be more than 1 mile high. So the comparison, there is no comparison. It's just a massive disparity. What you're dealing with classical literature is a dearth of evidence. What you're dealing with the New Testament is an embarrassment of riches.
The question of whether we can be confident that we have reconstructed documents extremely close to the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have originally produced is another place where there's a lot of misinformation in society. Textual critics of all or no theological perspectives agree that with all the New Testament documents, and particularly with the Gospels, we can go back with a high degree of confidence to documents as early as the 2nd century, which may well have been copied directly from the manuscripts that were the first editions, if you like, of the 4 Gospels. And that as these texts emerge, we have larger and larger fragments preserved until as we move into the 3rd century, we have nearly complete Gospels, and in the 4th and 5th centuries, nearly complete New Testaments. These represent amounts of evidence for which no other document or collection of documents anywhere in the ancient world enjoys. It's a luxury of evidence. And so while none of this proves that what the gospel writers were saying was necessarily all true, it certainly is more than adequate to show we know what their original claims were.
And I think that's the key. In other words, we've established here, because of the early testimony and the volume of evidence that we possess, that the transmission of them gives us what we know really was written in the originals, can be reconstructed in that way. Dr. Wallace basically made this quote on Apologetics 3:15 in 2012, and this pretty much represents what he said. The wealth of material that is available for determining the wording of the original New Testament is staggering. More than 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts, as many as 20,000 versions, and more than 1 million quotations by patristic writers, those are church fathers. In comparison with the average ancient Greek author, the New Testament copies are well over 1,000 times more plentiful. If the average size manuscript were 2 1/2 inches thick, all the copies of the works of an average Greek author would stack up 4 feet high, while the copies of the New Testament would stack up over a mile high. This is indeed an embarrassment of riches. So this is the quote that we saw him, we listened to him quote just a minute ago. So as we get into how do we know we have accurate copies, as we've said, we have earlier manuscripts, right? 25-year gap versus 1,000. We have more, right? 5,800 versus 10 to 20. We have more accurately copied manuscripts, 99.9% versus 90 to 95, and more abundant supported manuscripts that are other translations. So to get a quote from Bart Ehrman here. Now, he is an unbeliever, though at one time I think he said he was a Christian, but he's not one now. He's atheist or agnostic. But he agrees that the New Testament text is reliable, the transmission of the manuscripts themselves. And he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, which people say he did many times, but anyways, he said in that book, Bruce Metzger, who is also a New Testament scholar that actually does believe the Bible, is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. And so what are those? He goes on to say, if he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants, which would be errors, as we showed before, classified within a list of errors in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So this is a quote from Misquoting Jesus. Now, let's see. There are problems with Erdman's thesis, though. How could you know the original had been altered unless you knew what the original said? You couldn't. You have to have the original to know what the alteration was. And we pretty much know what the original is. About 80% of variants are spelling, which really provides no change in meaning. Because in Misquoting Jesus, he kind of argues the other way, so he talks out of both sides of his mouth. Only 1% affect any meaning, and none affect a significant Christian doctrine. So that's a very small percentage of the New Testament that the question of meaning would come up. And number 4, he holds a deconstructionist view of the text, postmodern view, applies to everything but his own book. Deconstruction, basically, well, we really don't, you take it apart and, well, this isn't original, this isn't original, this isn't original, and you end up with basically nothing. Postmodernism is the idea that, well, nobody can actually know the truth. Well, if you can't know the truth, then how do we know he's telling us the truth? So this is a problem with classic postmodernism anyways, but he wants to apply that concept that we can't really tell what the writer was saying, even if we have what we believe they wrote, but yet when we read his book, he wants us to know what he's saying is true, right? So the reader determines the meaning in deconstructionism. So as I read the text, I can determine what John or Matthew or Mark or Luke, what they meant. When I read Paul, I will determine what Paul meant. Well, and then everybody determines it differently. Well, the only problem is when we read his book, should I determine the meaning of that? In other words, that is not a tenable situation. It's a logical contradiction to take that type of philosophy when you're analyzing the New Testament or any of the Bible, or really any book that has valid historicity to it. So Daniel Wallace said, we heard from him about Bart Ehrman's view. He says, Bart Ehrman is part of a very small minority of textual critics in what he's saying. Frankly, I don't think he has challenged his biases. I think he has fed them. And that's from The Case for the Real Jesus. So, the problem is that once you get off in this tangent, and again, this presentation is, trying to give answers against what atheists are saying about the Bible, which we will get into the specifics after we get through this aspect of, giving evidence why the Bible can be believed. Because if we can't believe the Bible and if we have no objective evidence for it, then arguing from it is fruitless. All right. So a lot of people think the Bible is just an ancient book that nobody can know what it means, nobody can know what it says, blah, blah, blah. Kind of like Ehrman, even though, he says he agrees with Metzger, at one point, but then he writes his own book and says something entirely different. So anyways, we want to be able to establish that before we get into actually providing answers for specific verses where the atheist.org website tells us that they believe that there are contradictions. So manuscripts show the New Testament is accurate. It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain, especially in the case with the New Testament, Sir Frederick Kenyon. So he's the former director of the British Museum, like I said, and he had charge over all the ancient manuscripts. So if history can't be known, in other words, if we take the position and we say, well, I don't know, I mean, we can't really know anything out of ancient history, how can evolutionists claim to know the history of life? In other words, that it's spontaneously generated and that we've all evolved from the first life by natural selection and mutation. Well, they can't. If you can't go back and do kind of this forensic audit of information that we get out of history, then everything that an evolutionist claims is unverifiable. How can anybody be convicted of any crime? Because juries convict people for past wrongs. You have to still deal with forensic evidence. How can anyone complain of historical revisionism or historical propaganda? One cannot detect these things without knowing the truth about history. There has to be a way to verify, otherwise we can't know how far off we are. Finally, how can anyone prove Christianity is false? One would need to know the historical truth to prove such a claim. In other words, to claim that, well, Jesus never lived, the New Testament isn't right, Christianity is a false religion. Well, you have to know what is true in order to know what isn't. So, in conclusion, right, more manuscripts earlier, more accurately copied than any other book in the ancient world. So that's early testimony. Next, we'll get into eyewitness testimony, but we are at an hour, so I'm going to end it here, and then we'll jump into it the next time. So until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.